My name is Emmett Cantkier. I presented From Bottling Plant to Buried Trash, Soft Drinks at the MARTA Archaeological Collection at the Society for Historical and Underwater Archaeology Conference on January 11th. Unfortunately, the audio I recorded while presenting there sounded pretty bad, so I'm going to redo it for YouTube. I'm an undergraduate student at GSU. I've been working with the Phoenix Project for about a year and a half and have done the bulk of the photography and web design for the website. However, my primary research has been on the soft drink bottles in the MARTA Archaeological collection. There are almost infinite subjects for research among the many types of artifacts in the MARTA collection, from Civil War bullets to toys to toiletries. In the realm of glass bottles, there are ones for alcohol, condiments, medicines, poisons, and more. Why then did I choose specifically soft drinks? When I was taking part in the rebagging, I noticed how many of the soft drink bottles were from local companies that I've never heard of before, and how many Coca-Colas there were. The Coca-Cola company is so baked into Atlanta's economy and even the tourism industry, that it got me wondering how many smaller companies it had to beat out to get to that point, and was Atlanta always so preferential to Coke? What history lacks is democracy. Only the victors may stand the test of time. Coca-Cola is the ultimate victor in Atlanta's past and holds extensive records on its company history, though they're largely not public. Archaeology is more democratic, as the material remains of a company persist, so we may see a fair sample of what was consumed by the citizens of Atlanta. Carbonated water became commonplace in America in the 1800s, and we have some Torpedo and Hutchinson bottles that would have held carbonated water. But what we now know as syrupy soda brands really took off in the 1880s and 90s at soda fountains, and bottling them became widespread from 1900 to the 1920s, with improvements in bottle making and sealing technologies, in particular the crown cap seal and the Owens automatic bottle machine. Then they really took off in the 1920s during Prohibition. Atlanta specifically has been a major player in soft drink production since the turn of the 20th century, when Coca-Cola's second bottling plant was established in downtown. The first, surprisingly, was in Chattanooga, by the way, a year earlier. Said bottling plant, the Dixie Coca-Cola one, coincidentally was inside the building directly next to GSU's Dahlberg Hall, where all the artifacts are stored in the archaeology lab. Nowadays, it's the Baptist Collegiate Ministry building. This proximity got me interested. As I began finding addresses for old companies, a lot of them were very close to GSU and downtown. On this half-mile stretch of Edgewood Avenue, there were at least 5 soft drink company buildings. They were all most likely in business around the same time in the 20s and 30s. Unfortunately, the Dixie plant is the only building that survives. Atlanta is not great at historic preservation, so aside from the old directories and newspapers where I found these addresses, the bottles themselves are the only real evidence of these businesses existing. Aside from the business's location, there's a lot one bottle can tell us. When focusing in on a single bottle, it represents all of these data points. For example, Canada Dry originated in Toronto, but the glass for this bottle was made in West Virginia. The drink was bottled in New York, then transported to Georgia, where someone bought it. Some older bottles may have been reused several times. It was finally thrown out near the Vine City MARTA station. That's a lot to keep track of for every bottle, but it expands the data to a national and even international scale of trade and consumption. I had to take a few things into consideration when choosing the specifications of my subject. I chose to limit the study to the 20th century for a few reasons. First, most of our artifacts are quite modern to the time of excavating, as a large part of the work was survey surface collection. Second, as I mentioned before, Atlanta's bottling industry did not pick up until the 1900 founding of the Dixie Coca-Cola plant. I excluded Hutchinson and Torpedo bottles as they are older, often generic, and also milk bottles, as milk is more of an essential foodway than other soft drinks. These were also often returned to the store and reused many times, so that was also the case with soda bottles until around the 30s. This can create manufacture deposition lag, in which even bottles with precise manufacture dates can be deposited up to years later. Any dates I mentioned here are the dates of manufacture, not necessarily of deposition. In addition, I cannot claim that this study provides data on overall soda consumption in Atlanta, as soda fountains were a large part of business throughout the first half of the 20th century. In addition, as Lori Thompson mentioned in her presentation, there was significant looting by bottle collectors during the MARTA excavations. And as you're probably well aware, the stratigraphy of urban archaeology is very complicated, and I've not yet delved at all into where the bottles lay in relation to everything else. As a final note, I decided to include the few metal cans and bottle caps for sodas that we have, even though they're not glass bottles. The way I had to find all of the artifacts in the collection was a little convoluted. I had to start with the 1,300-page handwritten catalog of every artifact and note down every instance of a branded soda bottle, can, or cap. Then I put it in this spreadsheet sorted by a variety of attributes, and I've been slowly finding them in the hundreds of boxes one by one, taking pictures and researching the brands and bottlers' histories and locations. Quite a few bottles weren't noted in the specimen catalogs as a specific drink, so I found them while others were rebagging, so there's likely still more to be found. Dating and finding information on brands is sometimes not easy. The physical bottles can have maker's marks with dates and general manufacturer traits that indicate their age. There's really no academic sources on this kind of thing. There's a little bit on bottles themselves, but not specifically soda bottles, and certainly not one specific to southeastern brands. There are histories of Coca-Cola and Pepsi and some other big brands, but not really any for other brands that are no longer in business. Often I find myself speculating dates from newspaper activity and information from amateur bottle collectors online and the books that they write. Some bottles indicate all three of these variables in the soft drink industry: the brand, the bottler, and the manufacturer. Some only indicate the brand and bottler or manufacturer, and some only indicate the brand. Because the brand is the only variable on every bottle on my list, I primarily sorted my research on that. So far, I've identified 374 bottles of 61 brands, 41 of which have less than 5 samples. But as you can see, Coca-Cola is a huge portion, about 1/3 of them all. Here's a map of the distribution of the brands and some of the bottlers based on company addresses found in historical sources. This kind of data presents the questions of why, when, and how did some of these soft drinks infiltrate the Atlanta market, as well as taking a closer look at the success of local companies. About 2/3 of the bottles are from Georgia brands, though. Of course, a large part of this is Coca-Cola, which skews it a bit, but only 10 other states and Ontario were represented in terms of brand origin, primarily eastern states. I've represented the density within Atlanta itself by how many bottles were found within each contract construction unit or CCU of the MARTA excavations. These two maps are representing the same thing, by the way. As you can see, the data is a bit skewed because there's one huge excavation with over 100 bottles at Site 9FU91 in the center, which was a municipal trash dump. Also, some of them have no bottles because there were simply no artifacts collected in those CCUs. To remedy this, I've tried to calculate a density number based on the total number of IDs within the CCUs. This is also imperfect because one ID can have any number of artifacts within it, but adding them all up would not be an easy task. So the number of bottles divided by the number of IDs creates a more equal representation of density. The east-west line is fairly consistent, but the north-south line is more sparse. I haven't yet come to a conclusion on why yet, but I will be working on that. On this chart, I have plotted the date ranges of all the branded bottles at site 90A89. I chose this site because it is reasonably sized, and Dr. Dickens already determined it to be a domestic dump dating to around 1910 in a paper he wrote in the 80s. A few of the bottles I haven't dated just yet, but his conclusion would be mostly upheld here, as most of them overlap at 1910. Ideally, I'd like to do this for all the sites and parcels, perhaps. This presents a way of supporting hypothesized dates of sites because soft drink bottles can usually be dated relatively precisely. Next, I'll show some interesting case studies of individual companies. First, of course, Coca-Cola. As you saw, they make up about a third of the collection and span and range from the first bottles of 1900 to the most recent ones at the time of excavating. Some of them were coming from quite far away, even though the bottling operations were always centralized in Georgia, showing the huge demand for the drink within Atlanta. The huge disparity between the number of Cokes compared to its competitors shows that Atlanta was indeed always preferential to Coke. Afro Soda is an example of how integral newspaper archives are to my research. There was barely any information anywhere else, but the Atlanta Journal archive informed me that this brand was only active from 1903 to 1907. For the launch of the Afro Company, they offered prizes to people who collected the most amount of coupons from buying the drink. The fact that 4 Afro bottles were found together implies that the marketing strategy may have been successful, at least for a short time. However, in early 1908, they were offering all the company's assets up for sale in the newspaper. You may notice the bottles are very lopsided, which is indicative of them being cheaply mold-blown, which was the norm until industrial glass-making improved around the 1920s. Brown Boy Bottling Company was the first black-owned soda bottling company in the country. They produced a soda of the same name. It was co-owned by C.E. Prothero Jr., a business manager of Morris Brown College, and Jesse B. Blayton, pictured, who was better known as a radio entrepreneur and businessman. Brown Boy was sold in Atlanta, but the bottles were produced in Jackson, Mississippi by the Knox Glass Company, as identified by the J in a keystone mark on the bottom of the bottle. The company registered their patent in 1939, but unfortunately fizzled out sometime around 1953. Next, I'll show you examples from 3 companies that were within a block of each other in what is now the Old Fourth Ward neighborhood. You may have heard of RC Cola. It's still around in regular grocery stores today, but not super popular. We only have 4 RC Colas, but the Royal Crown Company also produced Knee-High and Chero Cola. The company was founded in Columbus, Georgia, but established a bottling plant in Atlanta in the 1950s or possibly before. The New Grape Company was a major player in the national soft drink industry until the late 20th century, but interestingly, we don't have many bottles from them, and especially not of their flagship product, New Grape Soda. However, we have 6 Suncrests, another one of their products, including a metal can. This building, built in 1937, is in the National Register of Historic Places because it was the national headquarters for more than 600 bottlers of New Grape around the country, and housed the advertising office and syrup manufacturing. Nowadays, it's apartments, but at least it's still standing. Lastly, there's the odd case of Maze Beverages. I can't find much of anything about it. These bottles all specify that Maze was a chocolate-flavored drink, I assume similar to Yoo-Hoo. One of the few sources I could find on it said that they also bottled Milky, Beer Lays, and Top Cola, which we have examples of, but they were also only licensed bottlers. These brands did not originate in Atlanta. This shows one way sodas would make their way over great distances. The rights to bottle them were licensed to local independent bottlers. But sometimes I find bottles that are simply mysteries. No records online, in newspapers, or even in patent records. When the guys on bottle forums don't know what they are, I'm kind of out of luck. The knowledge of these brands' existence only remains in the archaeological record, which is why this research is important in preserving Atlanta's economic history. Though I'm yet to form solid conclusions about my data, the soda bottles are undoubtedly an interesting and valuable resource within the MARTA Archaeological collection. There can be a lot of holes in the history of the soft drink industry that have the potential to be patched by urban archaeological efforts on modern sites. To wrap it up, I'd like to note some of my goals for the future of this project. It includes more research on company records, perhaps some archival research, and fleshing out my data. I'd like to use this to theorize consumer patterns in Atlanta and ultimately make some sort of public-facing exhibition. Thank you.